This is, as I said, one of many events that we organize here at Georgetown University in Qatar, because we're part of a community. We're not just sitting here in our tower of privilege. But this is a very particular, a very special event, because it is an event where our faculty, who have expertise ranging across a wide area of subjects, decide every year which is the one speaker they would like to bring from anywhere in the world for the next year as the distinguished faculty speaker. And this year, it's Dr. Vijay Prashad. So you're in for a treat. He's the George Marshall Kellner Professor of South Asian History and International Relations, but the introductions, in fact, are going to be done as befits a faculty distinguished lecture event by one of our very own faculty, Dr. Karine Walther, who was a professor of American history and professor of history, really, in general. So I'm going to hand over to Karine right away, and she will lead you into what promises to be a fabulous evening.
So thank you, everyone, for coming. And as Gerd mentioned, Vijay Prashad is the George and Martha Kellner Chair of South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. It is with both envy and awe that I tell you that Vijay has authored 14 books in the last 11 years. Most recently, these include Arab Spring, Libyan Winter, and Uncle Swami, South Asians in America Today. Two of his most well-known books, Karma of Brown Folk and Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting, were chosen by the New York Village Voice as Books of the Year. His book, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, was chosen as the best nonfiction book by the Asian American Writers Workshop in 2008, and also won the Muzaffar Ahmed Book Award in 2009. It was hailed by scholar Emanuel Wallerstein as, quote, an essential background for rethinking history. His most recent book, which came out this year, is entitled The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. It has received praise from the likes of Noam Chomsky, Tariq Ali, and Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who has described the book as, quote, a unique, exceptional study that weaves together events, processes, and strands into a comprehensive overview of the struggle of developing countries to change the world economic order. It is my great pleasure to welcome Vijay Prashad to speak with us tonight.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Karen. That was, I hope I live up to that. I have a very long presentation because this is based on about 7 years of reporting, more than academic work. So let me just get right to it. It's a long story. My talk is called India's Iran Policy, and there's a lot of material that I'm going to share with you. So welcome to this ride. Let's see how much time I'm going to take from you. Standing at a press conference with Turkmenistan's Deputy Prime Minister Rashid Meridov on January 22nd, India's President Pranab Mukherjee committed India once more to a natural gas pipeline from Central Asia to South Asia. India is deficient in energy resources, said the President, whereas Turkmenistan is rich in hydrocarbons. The economic complementarities are obvious, but not so clear are the political ramifications. The President said that the pipeline is important for bringing peace and development to our common region, signaling that such projects are as much about regional stability as they are about resource exchanges. Talk of this pipeline once more raised the question in New Delhi of the other natural gas project, the Peace Pipeline that was to run from Iran's South Fars field to India with access points for Pakistan's energy needs along the way. The pipeline projects that emerged out of considerations of resources came to embody the new regional ties that the governments wished to foster. These were the arteries of energy, no doubt, but also the manifestation of the links these countries knew had to be promoted. All states in the pipeline's path would have a vested interest in the pipeline whose existence might stay the poor of the dogs of war. Asian regionalism in the 1990s and 2000s was simply just an idea. It had not emerged as a sufficient counter to the other major narrative of international relations, namely US primacy. During the Cold War, the US and the USSR had both attempted to carve out camps of their allies and friends whose existence was protected by the superpowers' armaments and personnel. With the collapse of the USSR in the 1980s, a new narrative developed for global security and for US power projections. The US attempted to manage the world through a hub and spoke system. The US was the hub, with the spokes being its major client states whose task, in alliance with US troops in a network of overseas bases, was to manage the unruly states on the rim of the tire. These client states would allow the US access to bases and to its intelligence networks, enabling US power to project itself across the planet. The vision was grand, but it was also infected with hubris. It is out of the theory of US primacy that the US intervened to undermine the South Asian and Central Asian regional projects of the 1990s and 2000s. In 2005, US Ambassador to India David Mulford wrote to Washington, "New Delhi is trying to support us without alienating Tehran, on whom it depends for current oil supplies, future natural gas imports, and access to Afghanistan and Central Asia. If the US could guarantee India an alternative source of energy, India could make a break with Iran and help the US in its strategy for the isolation of that country. India, a friend of the US but not a client, could become a necessary part of the architecture of US primacy. After all, as Mulford wrote, India had a key voice in the non-aligned movement and could swing opinion in the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors. It was time, Mulford wrote, for us to know where India stood." The US-India nuclear deal that followed was a direct attempt to secure India into the narrative of US primacy and to forego that of Asian regionalism. It is the reason why India voted twice against Iran in the Atomic Energy Agency, despite the fact that it is India that has a nuclear program. It has twice tested a nuclear weapon in 1974 and 1998, and India is not a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and has not tested a weapon. India shifted to the side of US primacy in 2004, but since then its foreign policy has shifted once more to the middle. I was with a senior Indian diplomat last week. I mentioned to him that India seemed to be somehow sitting or standing between two stools, an Indian diplomat. One stool being US primacy, the other stool being regionalism. That's an apt image, he said, except we have not fallen between the two stools. Things are more fraught now and less clear. Talk of the peace pipeline and of linkages with Iran returned to the agenda after 2004. As US power enters a period of decline as a result of economic trials and two expensive and inconclusive wars, the moment of regionalism seems to have arrived. So I'm going to give you the story in three parts. The first part is called India Caught Between Two Narratives. India's foreign policy establishment has a very conflicted brief. One of India's most senior diplomats, Nirupama Rao, has, within the space of a few years, taken positions on Iran that both follow the regional narrative and the US primacy narrative. On July 5th, 2010, when Rao was the Foreign Secretary of India, she gave a speech at a conference in New Delhi. Here, Secretary Rao argued that India and Iran share fundamental complementarities and natural affinities. In her speech, Secretary Rao highlighted the Chabahar Port Project, which I'll talk about later, a signal joint venture to link Indian industry to Central Asia via the Southeast Iranian port city. This project, Secretary Rao pointed out, is at the heart of the common vision that India and Iran have for Afghanistan and the region as a whole. Secretary Rao did not speak as if in a vacuum. She acknowledged the pressure on Iran due to its nuclear program and hoped for a peaceful settlement. Without mentioning the name of the countries putting this pressure on, Secretary Rao worried about the consequential distortions of such coercion. And here's a little quote from her. We are justifiably concerned that the extraterritorial nature of certain unilateral sanctions recently imposed by individual countries with their restrictions on investments by third countries in Iran's energy sector can have a direct and adverse impact on Indian companies and, more importantly, on our energy security and our attempt to meet the development needs of our people. It is because of this analysis that Secretary Rao raised the most fundamental question for Indian diplomacy. How do we build a pragmatic and therefore enduring relationship, rising above hoary ideological positions, ensuring that our multifaceted ties are not held hostage to merely one or two issues? When Nirupama Rao left her post as Foreign Secretary in mid-2011, the Indian government sent her to become the next ambassador to the United States. Rao took over from Ambassador Meera Shankar, who was under enormous pressure from the US to reduce India's dependence on Iran's oil. India imports 80% of its oil, with 12% from Iran. At a speech at Harvard University at the Kennedy School, Ambassador Shankar followed the grain of thought of Secretary Rao. Iran is an important country in our extended neighborhood, she said, with which we have civilizational links. We are conscious of the need to objectively address Iran's nuclear issue. We have maintained that Iran should fulfill its obligations as a signatory to the NPT regime. Now, just check the irony here. Of course, India is not a signatory to the NPT. While having the right of peaceful uses of nuclear energy, India on its part has consistently implemented all relevant UN Security Council resolutions. Ambassador Rao had to also wend between India's economic and regional needs and pressure from both the United States and the US lobby within India. In February 2012, Ambassador Rao told National Public Radio that India simply cannot cut its ties from Iran. There are domestic economic factors, with the Indian government aware that if India stops import of Iranian oil, prices will rise. We have to meet the energy needs of hundreds of millions of people, she said, and please remember, at least 400 million people are in poverty. Then she pointed out, the volume of oil that we import from Iran is declining, and it will obviously have to continue to decline, but it is going to take time. The key phrase here is certainly, it will obviously have to continue to decline. Why is this obvious? Because of the immense US pressure on India to cut oil imports from Iran. In other words, the logic of US primacy has begun to subvert a general consensus among the Indian policy community that India must develop closely its regional ties, including with Iran, and not yoke itself too firmly to the US and to US national interests. 2 years after Ambassador Rao's address in Delhi, Yash Sinha, one of the most senior diplomats in India on the Iran desk, gave a speech at a conference funded by an Iranian and Indian NGO. Sinha obliquely pointed to the pressure put on Indo-Iranian relations, but his emphasis was on bilateral trade. Between April 2011 and March 2012, one of the high points of pressure on India from the US, Indo-Iranian trade increased by 18.76%. US pressure is largely on the oil imports, and the US has made it hard for India to cover its oil bill. This is why Sinha called for a diversification of Indo-Iranian trade, with Indian exports of wheat and pharmaceuticals as a way to cover the cost of import of oil. To underscore the linkages between the two countries, Sinha reiterated India's commitment to the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline and to Chabahar and its port. Sinha's position was reiterated by Foreign Secretary Ranjan Mathai in August 2012. We would certainly like to expand India's exports to Iran, he said, despite pressure from the US to cut trade from that country. Mathai and Sinha recognize that the ground is shifting beneath their feet. You see, I have to go back a little bit and tell you the history of where this regionalism comes from. So this is going to be a little bit here, a little diversion from that story. US primacy is in decline, although its planetary dominion will not collapse immediately. Although China will, by 2016, by IMF, their analysis, have the world's largest economy, it is unlikely to seek the mantle of something like Chinese primacy. China seems at this point eager actually to work through the new BRICS group and to manage a system framed by multipolarity and regionalism. Old non-alignment is now history. The debt crisis of the 1980s broke the back of the Third World Project, and it shattered the confidence of the non-aligned movement. The NAM, the non-aligned movement, which represents 2/3 of the world's governments, continues to function, but barely. Non-alignment as a guiding doctrine has become fodder for nostalgia as indebted countries begin to forge links with a resurgent West, this is in the 1980s and 90s, in light of the collapse of the East. Bilateral free trade agreements with the US and Europe came alongside IMF programs for austerity, military deals that allowed US bases on formerly proud anti-colonial soil. But the NAM organization continued to meet. It didn't stop meeting. But it didn't propose anything. It never proposed a new vision. It simply met and then passed some resolutions, and then they went home. The tide began to turn in the early 2000s. In 2003, the NAM's chair, South African Thabo Mbeki, attempted to create a peaceful solution against the US rush to war against Iraq. The US pressured South Africa to expel Iraq's ambassador, but failed. It did, however, go to war, disregarding the word from the NAM and therefore 2/3 of the world's countries. In the same year, in 2003, the West refused to honestly discuss development and trade. They insisted that subsidies to northern agriculture did not violate their own free trade nostrums. This incensed the South at the Cancun meeting of the World Trade Organization. Brazil, China, India, South Africa, the group of the least developed countries, Caribbean and Pacific bloc, the African bloc, they resisted pressure from the WTO and from its commissioner, Pascal Lamy, to steer the organization to a compromise. The South prevailed, there was no deal, and Lamy lamented. The World Trade Organization, he said, remains a medieval organization, which of course meant that it was not a pliable organization. The experience of the Iraq War and of Cancun led to the creation of a new group, the IBSA Dialogue, which included one country from each of the southern continents, India, Brazil, and South Africa. Complementarities in these countries led them to increase trade among themselves and to work together at international forums for their interests and for the South in general. Over the course of several meetings, the dialogue framed a new intellectual agenda, now not so much non-alignment as regionalism and multipolarity. Brazil brought the Latin American experience to the table, notably the process that led eventually to the creation of the political bloc, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and the trade bloc, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. Regionalism and multipolarity became the central intellectual themes of the BRICS when China and Russia joined Brazil, India, and South Africa to create a major new world grouping. Non-alignment is simply the historical word in the NAM's name, but it does not define its politics nor the emergent political views of many of the leading NAM actors. The new politics is no more for non-alignment, but for the more realistic platforms of regionalism and multipolarity. Second part, India in the US narrative. Last month, a senior Indian diplomat, Chinmay Ghare Khan, who was Boutros Ghali's advisor, was talking to an Iranian diplomat who said to him, "Your Qibla is Washington." So that's the head quote for this section, India and the US narrative. In 1991, things seemed to be moving on a different track. India's economic liberalization policy was inaugurated with much fanfare and with considerable nudging from the IMF. With liberalization came a reorientation of foreign policy. There was an assessment in the early 1990s that the shift from a dirigist economy entailed a friendlier attitude toward the West. The emergent consensus among the New Delhi elite was that normal relations with Israel would send a signal to Washington of Delhi's seriousness toward the established power equation. Non-alignment was to be squandered on behalf of a new alliance policy with the United States, a kind of alliance that might mimic the special relationship between Israel and the United States. The Indian government recognized the State of Israel in January 1992, and over the course of the decade, developed close ties for the import of military hardware and intelligence software. India imports half of Israel's defense production. As well, India tempered its previous resolute backing for the Palestinian struggle. This was an important signal to Washington. It meant that India was willing to sacrifice its own ideological and institutional commitments for a narrative of the world favorable to Washington. If India could become close to Israel, the door to the special relationship that really mattered, which is with the United States, opened wider. By the late 1990s, the Indian government turned toward increased arms purchases from the United States and welcomed US military personnel to train with Indian armed forces. This close relationship sent the next hint. Since much of the military relationship is also commercial, it is fitting that these two elements, the military and the commercial, remained side by side. The battlefield that turned out to be the most contentious was the question of Iran. It was the test case of India's subordination to the US narrative of world affairs. The Bush administration was adamant that Iran be isolated, despite Washington's adventure in Iraq and its own isolation in the world community. Iran poses a threat to the establishment's order of things in West Asia. For the US and its clients, Iran has been a threat since 1979. In January 2004, the Bush administration sent David Mulford to be the ambassador to India. Mulford remained at this post until 2009. It was a crucial period. When Mulford came to India, relations between Tehran and New Delhi were on a reasonably good footing. Congruence on Afghanistan was the most recent foreign policy linkage, but so too was the question of energy. The deal from Washington was simple. India would soft pedal the natural gas pipeline and it would get assistance in building up its nuclear sector. Any disentanglement from Iran would allow India freedom of maneuver toward the US narrative of world affairs. When next the United States needed a vote to sanction Iran in the Atomic Energy Agency or the UN, it might call upon India, and thereby confuse the NAM bloc, which was often led by India on these matters. To make the case, Bush sent his Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to India in 2005. She got what the United States wanted from India, but gave very little. She gave a verbal commitment for India to have a permanent seat at the Security Council, but they didn't actually promise that this would happen. Germany, by the way, and Japan had a verbal commitment in the 1980s, but that hasn't gotten them much. It was clear by 2005 that the nuclear deal was a quid pro quo for scuttling the peace pipeline and for giving the United States political cover in the NAM-type forums in the policy to isolate Iran. The best-case scenario, by the way, for nuclear power, this is by the Indian government, was that it would provide no more than 5% of India's primary energy needs by 2015, hardly a solution to India's energy problem. It was rather a political matter. An India now anointed as a legitimate nuclear power and emboldened to seek its proper place in the Security Council must earn that role by acting maturely, namely working with the international community, which means the West, to isolate revisionist powers such as Iran. That was the bottom line. The aggravations of David Mulford come out clearly in the cables he sent to the US State Department. In early September 2005, prior to India's vote against Iran in the Atomic Energy Agency on September 24th, Mulford met Shyam Saran, at the time Foreign Secretary of India. In Mulford's rendering, he delivered the mail wrapped in a brick. Mulford told Saran that the time was drawing near for fence sitters to make hard decisions. Then comes the clear quid pro quo. Many in the US Congress and throughout Washington, he reminded Saran, were watching India's treatment of Iran prior to congressional debate on the US-India civilian nuclear initiative. One could only come if the other was demonstrated. Why was India's vote so important? And here's Mulford again. India had a key voice in the NAM and could swing opinion in the Atomic Agency Board of Governors. It was time for us to know where India stood. From the US side, the nuclear deal was about nuclear energy and the $60 billion promised in purchases for nuclear hardware, largely from the United States, but also the French. But more so, the nuclear deal was about cementing India's shift from its non-aligned foreign policy to being subordinate to the US narrative. There were some irritants, and one of the main irritants was the Foreign Service in India. It refused to follow the narrative. So one example of how the US government influenced the Indian external affairs bureaucracy is in its attempt to undermine Nirupam Sen, not Nirupama Rao, who's the current Indian ambassador to the United States, but Nirupam Sen, who was the Indian permanent representative to the United Nations. Sen had come to the UN from his post as India's ambassador to Sri Lanka. An intellectual with seasoned understanding of world affairs, Sen threw his energy into a push for more democracy at the UN and less fealty by the NAM bloc and India to Washington. John Bolton, who was then US ambassador to the UN, had it in his head that somehow Nirupam Sen must be removed from his position. He called Sen an unreformed communist. At a lunch meeting between Sen's deputy, Ajay Malhotra, and Bolton's deputy, Alejandro Wolf, the Indian said that he'd been sent to New York with instructions from India's Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran to cooperate with the US government on a broad range of issues, and, as Wolf put it, to check his boss's antiquated instincts. Malhotra criticized Sen's confrontational attitude to the US government, which led Wolf to his own assessment. In May 2009, the Indian government ended Sen's tenure and sent as his replacement Hardeep Singh Puri, whose appointment pleased the US government. In a meeting on May 1st in New Delhi, Malhotra indicated, this is the deputy of Sen, Ajay Malhotra, indicated that he wanted to increase US-India engagement to a higher degree of convergence. The head of the US-India Forum of Parliamentarians, Ramesh Chandran, put it very plainly to the Americans. Noting Puri's Moscow-educated UN predecessor Nirupam Sen's proclivity to cling to a leftist, non-aligned mentality, Chandran favorably compared Puri, the new ambassador, whom he contended had a much more modern and 21st century way of thinking. Now, unfortunately, Puri, who's the current ambassador, didn't meet the expectations. He has been a thorn in the side of the liberal interventionists. He's the major critic of the responsibility to protect doctrine in its use in Libya and elsewhere. The US architects of the new strategic relationship with India must see their work as a success. Their junior partners, on top of the Congress-led government in India, have freed themselves of pressure from a weakened parliamentary left, and dissent within the Foreign Service has been, to some extent, minimized. Part 3, the Southern Silk Road. Now this map will make sense behind me. I'll be giving you some names. You can look at the picture. I never do PowerPoint demonstrations because I find they always break when you're doing it. But I'll give you a map. So there it is. Regionalism rests firmly on the mantle of geography. Attempts to isolate a country for ideological reasons do not always work. The West demands that all countries reduce to zero their oil imports from Iran. US-occupied Afghanistan is landlocked, but it shares a 936-kilometer border with Iran. NATO's supply lines through Pakistan are prone to political turmoil. and NATO has faced problems in Central Asia as governments there have cleverly bargained up price for base rentals and use of their land routes. Afghanistan, therefore, listen to this very carefully, Afghanistan buys half of its oil from Iran. It has been impossible for the United States to insist that the Karzai government in Kabul join the blockade against Iran. The adverse effects of an already crisis-prone Afghanistan and therefore on the fragile occupation would only intensify. Despite ideological entanglements sufficient to bewilder the most cautious political scientists and a fragile security environment that is not helped by the agenda of warfare, new maps are being created in Central Asia and in South Asia. Roads, rail lines, and pipelines move from blueprints to the ground. A freight line will run from Herat in western Afghanistan to Mashhad in northeastern Iran and then onward to Turkey. The Chinese east-west line rail network runs from the Pacific Rim, crossing into Kazakhstan, leading into Uzbekistan, Tashkent, Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, all storied names of the old Silk Road, and then onwards into Turkey through northern Iran. All this is part of the new Silk Road, the new southern Silk Road. The regional agenda between India and Iran is a piece of this southern Silk Road, and it comes in three aspects. First, oil and gas from Iran to India. Second, wheat and medicines from India to Iran. And third, a maritime caravanserai. But first, India's energy. India's political leadership says that India will reduce its import of Iranian oil and suspend the pipeline for natural gas. But a senior Foreign Service official, on the other hand, told me that there's no government pressure on importing firms to cut back on Iranian oil. The public sector units and Esser, the private company, which import oil, have voluntarily slowed their purchases from Iran because of the financial difficulties posed by Western sanctions. It has become virtually impossible to pay Iran for the oil, and insurance companies are unwilling to cover the ships and the cargo that leaves Iranian ports. In 2012, the Indian Export Credit Guarantee Corporation decided to underwrite the shipment of oil, but it did so with very cautious intent. It's not a permanent arrangement. Since 2008, the West has led an aggressive agenda to isolate Iran's ability to take payments for its oil shipments. In December 2010, the Reserve Bank of India hastily left the Asian Clearing Union mechanism, through which Indian firms paid for Iranian oil. Arrangements through the Turkish Halk Bank and the German-based Europe-Iranian Handelsbank provided short-term measures for Indian firms to reach Iran. But under Western pressure, these paths were closed down on February 6th of this year. In early 2012, the main financial messaging service for international money transfers, SWIFT, announced that it would cut Iran out of its network. So Iran is now isolated from the international financial system. In early 2012, the Indian and Iranian governments worked on a mechanism to sidestep the pressure from the West. By March of last year, the two sides agreed to a rupee payment mechanism. 45% of payment for Iran's oil will be made in rupees, with the status of the remainder very unclear. Iran's Parsian Bank opened an account at the Kolkata-based UCO Bank, where it will accumulate its rupees. The Indian government has annulled a mandatory withholding tax of 42% to facilitate this arrangement. A source in the Ministry of External Affairs told me that India would like 100% of the oil payments to be made in rupees. The pipeline from Iran is also, diplomats tell me, not off the agenda. The only reason the Turkmenistan pipeline seems to be moving faster is because the rates promised for the natural gas are lower than those set by Iran. Iran has pegged the price at international rates plus a certain percentage of profit, said one diplomat. Where is the advantage for us? So that's energy. Second, trade. Indian industrial and agricultural interests are eager to enter the Iranian market. On January 2nd of this year in Delhi, the head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Saeed Jalili, said that Western sanctions on Iran are an opportunity, not a threat. This view has been echoed by senior Indian diplomats who also say that they would like to increase trade if payment and shipping related difficulties are overcome. In March of 2012, the Federation of Indian Export Organization sent a delegation to Tehran, and in December of last year, a delegation from the Pharmaceutical Export Promotion Council of India went to Tehran. Both of them have returned with a certain objective. Currently, India imports about $15 million, $12 to $15 million of $1 billion of oil, worth of oil. Indian trade with Iran is only at 2.74 billion. But an Indian Commerce Ministry person told me they want to increase it to 30 billion, which seems a little out of the imagination right now. But the Commerce Ministry official is honest in his statement that India is not motivated by political desire to break Western sanctions. Economic interests are at the forefront. But 2.74 billion to 30 billion, that's very high, particularly for two reasons. The two main products that India wants to sell are wheat and pharmaceuticals. Here's the problem. Iran produces 13.8 tons of wheat per year, but has taken to import about 5 million tons, which is still a lot of wheat. A 100-fold increase over the past year. This imported wheat comes from Pakistan, makes sense, it's nearby, and Iran barters that for iron ore and fertilizer. That's how they do the trade. China sends wheat to Iran. Also, some of it is barter. But you'll be amazed that one of the largest exporters of wheat into Iran is the United States. Iran stopped buying Indian wheat in 1996 because of the outbreak of a fungal disease called the Karnal bunt. In mid-January of this year, an Iranian delegation was in India to discuss quality controls for the import of 200,000 tons of Indian wheat. Very modest sum, because they want to increase this to 2 to 3 million tons of Indian wheat per year. But the talks broke down, with Iran refusing to accept the 0.25% tolerance level for the Karnal bunt in Indian wheat. This is the same level that they allow for American wheat. But you know, when you have had American wheat coming in, even in Iran, there is an idea that Indian wheat may be inferior. You know, American wheat, it's sort of McDonald's of wheat or whatever. Indian wheat, you know, India can send you soap, but not food products. It might come with intestinal diseases or... So even in the middle of such immense pressure, they would prefer to eat American wheat. Second, pharmaceuticals. In October, the US Treasury introduced a standing authorization that permits US firms to sell some medicines and supplies without seeking permission from the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Most of US pharmaceutical concerns have a wide berth around Iran. So India's government is very interested in selling drugs to Iran, particularly from December, when Iran made a submission to the world community saying we have now a critical shortage of drugs. But Indian pharmacy has a problem. On the one side, Iran is an immense market for Indian pharma. On the other side, Indian pharmacy, very cleverly, is the major part of the international pharma market where it takes over when American pharmaceuticals create genetic products. So the moment you go off patent any drug, you can be sure an Indian company is going to seize that and start producing generics at a fraction of the cost. So the pharmaceutical companies are in a bind. Do you sell what might end up being, several, maybe $1 billion worth of drugs to Iran? Or do you maintain this relationship with American pharma? And that standing authorization is not enough of an inoculation at this time for pharma to go into this. So even in the two big areas of wheat and drugs, there are some very serious problems. In May 2016, finally Chabahar, in May 2012, Afghanistan's Commerce and Industries Minister Anwar al-Haq Ahadi and Iran's ambassador to Afghanistan, Abul Fazl Zorevand, signed an agreement to deepen the trade ties between Afghanistan and Iran. At Chabahar, about 50 hectares of land beside the port has been set aside for the construction of a hub for Afghan traders. Few people paid any attention to this pact. In fact, nobody has reported from Chabahar. When I began to write about this for Asia Times, nobody had been covering the Chabahar port in any detail. It's amazing. It's completely off the map. I tried to sell the New York Times, tell them you should do a story of it. It's an amazing thing. No interest. Few people paid any attention to this pact, although it has much broader implications than for those Afghan traders. For the past decade, the Indian government has been working with the Iranians to upgrade the Chabahar port, with the expectation that eventually Indian ships will dock there and unload cargo destined not only for the Iranian market, but also crucially for Afghanistan and Central Asia. Chabahar comes from the words Cha and Bahar, 4 springs, suggesting that the port has 4 seasons of springtime. It is a major warm water port and will allow goods to travel into Central Asia throughout the year. This port has a history from 1992, when Iran first created a special economic zone there. In September 2000, India, Iran, and Russia signed an agreement to build roads. Much of this was delayed by the Afghan war in 2001. But in 2003, in January, the governments of Afghanistan, India, and Iran met in Tehran to sign the development and construction of the Transit and Transport Infrastructure Bill memorandum. Based on this, they worked on improvement of the road from Chabahar to Delaram and eventually to Zaranj in Afghanistan. The Indian government has spent millions of dollars building the road and refurbishing the port. These massive transportation networks mimic those being built elsewhere in the Indian Ocean. Burma is the other test case. The Chinese have built a port in Ramre, and the Indians have built a port in Akyab. And Chinese also built a port in Sri Lanka, in, I think, Hambantota. They've built a big port. And the Chinese have recently taken over the port in Gwadar from a Singapore company. In fact, the handover happened yesterday. So the Chinese have taken over the Gwadar port. But Gwadar, because it's not been developed, they're going to develop a rail and road link to Chabahar to use the roads the Indians have built. This is a very significant thing that they are doing. In mid-February 2012, President of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan met for their 3rd trilateral summit in Islamabad. They announced there that they were going to start working on these kind of road linkages and such. In other words, India and Pakistan, despite all that animosity, is also understanding that there are some mutual benefits in developing these ports. The Chinese port at Gwadar is currently not linked upwards to Peshawar and into Afghanistan, largely because the security situation in Balochistan, believe it or not, is maybe worse than the security situation in southern Afghanistan. 4 Chinese workers were killed in the Gwadar port not long ago. Afghanistan remains under US occupation. India seeks a close relationship with the United States. Iran and the United States are hostile powers. Yet these 3 countries, Afghanistan, India, Iran, with very different relations with the US, now find that geography is their destiny. A pragmatic and regionalist foreign policy built on the urgency of economic development draws these states together. Afghanistan needs access to a port and oil, as well as manufactured goods. Iran needs to sell its oil. India wants to find a market for its manufactured goods and to find a ready supply of oil. Such linkages, such comparative advantages are hard to ignore. The Southern Silk Road is an important development in the creation of regionalism, linking South Asia to Central Asia, West Asia to China. No longer will these regions need to go through the US and European-dominated routes to conduct their trade. The hub, the West, and spokes, the rest, approach to world affairs is being rendered anachronistic slowly by these developments. As a result of the growth of regionalism, US primacy and its unipolar approach might be set aside. The future is not tomorrow or the next year, but it is upon us. A rational foreign policy for that future would seek to enhance regional ties in the present. Between 2 stools, yes. Not fallen on the floor, yes. But moving from one stool to the next. Thank you so much.